Hi there, my name is Becca White. I'm one of the Windsor County State Senators, and we are going to have a conversation about land use and planning today. If you have not watched something on JAM before, this is your local cable access folks who are helping produce this segment. And I represent the White River Junction area and Windsor County at large. So I'm really grateful for the help of the folks who are putting this together. So we can start with that. I'm joined today to have this conversation with Kevin Geiger, who is the Chief Planner for Two Rivers Ottauquechee Planning
Regional
Commission, TRORC, and Commissioner Alex Farrell, who is the Commissioner of Housing and Community Development under the Agency of Commerce. So thank you so much for joining and trying this interesting podcasty filming style of conversation. My hope today is that we can spend a bit of time talking about what happened during the legislative session around housing, land use development, and then what folks should know going forward because of that legislation and anything else that really feels relevant for the conversation. I serve on natural resources and energy during the traditional session, which we just ended, and we talked a lot about this. So before we get into any specific bills, I'm wondering if either of you could tell us a little bit about what land use, planning, zoning, what does that mean?
Sure.
And who does it affect and why does it matter? So I don't know if you want to start, Commissioner.
Yeah, maybe I'll start at the state level and talk a bit about how we interact with it, and then we can pass it to you. So from the state view, the way we talk about land use and zoning, generally speaking, this has to do with permitting, how folks use their land and what kind of review goes into that use. So if somebody wants to put a development on their property, depending on what they're doing, that may or may not require certain permits. And the way we determine that is really how we set the policy for the state, where things are going to be built. Generally in Vermont, we have a tendency to want to focus things that we build in our areas where we have built environment. So downtowns and villages, and then separated by sort of pastures and woods. And so in Vermont, we've really tried to make sure that the permitting, the jurisdiction on the statewide permitting, one of those is through Act 250, which we talk a lot about. We'll talk about a little bit more today. We use that to guide buildings and development, and in my case, housing.
Yeah.
That interacts on the municipal level, and where I'll pass it off to Kevin, because each municipality can guide development within their own boundaries.
Yeah.
Okay. I may take us back one level.
Do it.
Because I often do that. Because I'm assuming for the people out there, they're not conversant with planning, zoning, and what the various pieces are. And I begin with that concept that what we see around us is planned. You know, when you're driving to town, when you're in a downtown, when you're out in the fields, that's all planned. So it's not a question of do we plan or do we not plan. It's a question of how we're going to plan. Our land use, because it may be somebody making an individual decision on their property, or the town making some decisions, or the region, or the state. But there's always planning going on. It's not just we don't just wake up and start doing stuff.
Yeah, there's not just a building that pops up one day. Right. It takes a little bit more.
I guess I should nail this thing on.
It used to be that way. But then we kind of thought maybe we should all have a conversation about where stuff goes.
Yes, and that's very much how it begins, is with that conversation. At the regional and at the local level. So local planning all takes place by the planning commissioners who are appointed by the select boards. And they're not some distant form of government. They're people, and for anybody who wants to out there, you can usually be on the planning commission.
And I should just full disclosure, I am happily married to a Hartford planning commissioner. And I asked him before our conversation today, I said, babe, I need one thing that you're going to tell me that the local folks that people should know about their planning commissioners. And he said, tell them we don't have a lot of control. that was his.
Is true. Yes. So planning commissions are where town plans, and then subsequent zoning, if you want that, start. You're not required to have a plan or zoning in Vermont or subdivision. But if you're going to make rules, you're required to have a plan. And that's that community discussion about what do we want to go where. So
just to talk about that a little bit, you're saying that a town has to have kind of an infrastructure of local government to even be able to set rules.
Yeah.
And that is kind of special. Like in our area, at least Windsor County, we have towns that are, and you don't serve just Windsor County, you also serve kind of the surrounding area, but you have towns that have a whole planning department like Hartford.
Yeah.
And a design review board and a zoning board and a planning commission. And then you have towns that have nothing.
None of that.
They don't even have really a staff person who maintains that.
No.
So
Hancock, is less than 400 people.
Yeah.
Over in Addison County, that's one of ours. But they have a plan.
Mm-hmm.
They have a town plan. And they have a planning commission. And so that is, to me, that's where the democracy happens. People often think the democracy happens in permitting, and that's really where the democracy should not be. But they all show up and like, we like this project. Irrelevant, because the rules get made before then.
Yeah.
And it's not a popularity contest because that wouldn't be constitutional, amongst other reasons. So back at that planning commission, but there's rules about that, and state statute has things about if you're going to do a town plan, it has to have these things. And Alex was talking about the state planning goals.
Yeah.
So that's really that dense settlement surrounded by open countryside is kind of the number one state planning goal. But it's a goal. It isn't there isn't a law in Vermont that's how you build. That's a goal. It's only when you actually start having regulations or if something trips Act 250 that the rules come into play.
And so we've already talked about Act 250 twice now, so it's already come up.
Yeah.
So let's just tell people if they're listening to this, they're probably someone who's interested in the topic. They probably know what Act 250 is, but I wasn't alive when Act 250 became a law. I'm very fortunate that Senator Dick McCormick, who serves on natural resources and energy and is my mentor and the now retiring Windsor County Senator, he was there. And he has a lot of stories and knowledge about Act 250 and what the process is, whether it's a law or the actual process. So could either of you describe Act 250 is a landmark piece of legislation that passed way back when, the 70s? I don't know what year.
75.
75.
74, 75.
Yeah. There you go. And it created a whole set of processes to allow for people to look at a criterion of things that they could contest, like a building or a structure or development on. That's kind of my basic understanding. And it seems like philosophically that came from a belief that Vermont has an identity and looks a certain way. Like we have our beautiful rolling hills. I mean, you've both kind of described it in kind of the professional way, like dense downtown natural landscape. But for Vermonters, that's like being in downtown White River Junction, but also having West Hartford. Right. It's having kind of the diversity of landscape and really a beautiful forest and natural space right there for you to be able to access. And that's very different than what we see in other states. Like when people come to our state because of how we look aesthetically, and the feel of our communities because of that. So Act 250 feels like it was our piece of legislation that kind of started that trend of staying rather than maybe other states. So that's kind of my perspective. I don't know, what does Act 250 actually do in reality? And kind of, you can challenge me on my historical perspective.
No, I'll jump into there a little bit and just cover statutorily what it does. It was started around big projects, and I think somewhat around Stratton Mountain down in the south. But on the theory that local towns didn't have the wherewithal or the regulations in place then to deal with a big project. And so they needed some more oomph to the regulatory process. It is not zoning. I heard on the radio this morning, like statewide zoning. Actually, it's not zoning. It is a set of rules, though. But everything doesn't trigger it. And so in general, if you're going to build in many parts of Vermont 6 houses or 6 lots, then you're going to trigger Act 250. So, in bigger towns, it's 10 houses and 10 lots. And then we'll talk about the exemptions a little bit later around Act 250, which are really around housing, not anything else in particular. But a lot of the ways our landscape is not a product of Act 250 because it's in my town, Pomfret, right? I live in Pomfret. It's 2-acre zoning in town.
And it's beautiful. We love Pomfret.
And it's beautiful.
Cloudland Farms.
But there's nothing in our state or our local regulatory structure that doesn't say there is a house every 200 feet on every road and in every field. That's actually what the zoning, you got 2-acre zoning, you have
that's what happens.
13,000 houses in Pomfret, right? And so Act 250, that state planning goal of village, countryside, Act 250 doesn't stop you from building house on every road. It just hasn't happened yet. So sometimes I think we go, oh, that's because of this rule when there is not a causation.
Oh, that's I see what you're saying. Like development could have happened in that way if we had that. Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting angle. So Act 250 is not, it actually set up a whole structure of how someone like a big developer, let's say they want to build, like this is what we heard in the State House. They want to build a 15-unit apartment building in Fairleigh, let's say.
Sure.
They feel once they trigger Act 250, it starts this whole process. So what if I was to be building an apartment, like what, I know you worked really closely with a lot of the developers, kind of in seeing how Act 250 affected them now and what they wanted to see. So what does it do? And yeah,
I think of Act 250 as a backstop, and I like how you describe it, where it's not zoning, but what it does is at a certain level of development, it's going to trigger review, and there's certain criteria involved. And as you walk through those various phases of the Act 250 process, it reviews the project for environmental impacts, impacts on the water and wastewater systems. Have you made sure that you've taken that into account? And
traffic.
That's right. Exactly. And so it's essentially due diligence. So once you hit a certain threshold, and as you said, it's somewhat dependent on the size of the town, that development, where it's going and what you've planned to do is well thought out. And then it's going to meet the goals of the state, and it's not going to unduly burden the area.
And what I've heard from developers, or at least I felt like was the kind of general sentiment of developers, was when I trigger Act 250, it becomes harder for me to build or it becomes more costly. And there was a lot of debate about the reality of that. But if I wanted to build something, it seemed like the process was getting the proper permits, both at the local and at the Act 250 level, going through the Natural Resources Board, which I don't know, we'll talk about the bill, but I don't remember where we landed on the name. I think it ended up with Land Use Regulation Board?
Review
Board. Okay. The LURB was all I landed on. The LURB.
And I've got beef with that, by the way.
with the name LURB?
With the LURB.
So the people...
I was trying to get people to say, let's do LRB instead. No, they said
we went with LURB. We liked it.
Yes.
These are the friendly debates we have.
So there would be people appointed to the LURB, which will be known as the LURBians. The
LURBians, yes. We've got, just watch out. This is wonky Vermont planning stuff. But so you have developers who go through this process, and we heard that it was slowing them down. And it was costing them more money. Again, back to, is that true? Is that not true? We heard differing opinions. But why were we hearing that from developers? Like, what were the situations that I know we're experiencing a housing crisis. That's something that the governor has talked a lot about. It's something we hear all the time. Like, we just are not building enough housing to meet the need. Yeah. And I think there was a press release where we're like 20,000...
I'll hit that because I keep hearing that number over and over again because that was the state's comprehensive housing assessment comes out, and there was a little bit of a misrepresentation or something there because that said we need 24,000 as a minimum.
Yes,
housing units between now and 2035 to deal with population expansion.
Oh, so that's including.
That's not our current need. That's just our incremental future need in the next 10 years. Our current need is more like 90,000.
Next 5 years.
In the next 5 years.
So you're saying, you're not disagreeing that's a problem. You're saying it's actually worse than even the recent press release that came out had described.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so back to the Act 250. So developers, different home builders and different developers view Act 250 differently, not because they disagree about it, but because they might operate at different scales. So if you were to talk to a large developer, like somebody that might operate here in downtown White River Junction or somebody that operates in Burlington, and they are used to a large multi-phase project that's going to be a couple hundred units, they're already planning to go through Act 250. That, the fee, you really don't hear people talk about the Act 250 fee. It's not that burdensome. Developers aren't pointing to that. What the smaller developers will point to is that they say they don't have capacity to get through the process because they feel as though it's just it's additional regulations, additional paperwork, it's additional competencies that they might not have. They might not have an attorney on staff or someone that does that. And so for their own sake, they just plan to avoid it. And wherever that threshold is drawn, they just say, I'll just build under that. And whether or not they'd do just fine with Act 250, I think a lot of small scale builders don't. That's not factored in. They just say, I'd rather not do that process if I don't have to.
And so when we saw kind of the conversation in the legislature, it was those small to medium developers who really are the bread and butter developers in our state. Like, we don't have a crazy number of big projects. It's usually in the, at least what I've experienced, and you actually know the numbers, but it's like usually 15 to 40 units is like. Yeah,
we don't see, it just in Lebanon over here, there's a thing in the paper about a potential 465 unit development. Yeah. We don't see that hardly ever in the state of Vermont.
Yeah, in New Hampshire. But okay, so thank you both for that kind of conversation.
So just a bit more on Act 250.
Like, I can't let it go.
No, well, tell me if I'm getting too weedy on this. Commercial establishments over an acre. I think Act 250 has been very good about keeping commercial establishments out of places versus residential, because we're going to talk a lot about housing. And so
this is like the Milne. So an example might be in our area, the Milne development,
which was commercial and residential, but commercial. Yeah. And so I think it's important for people to think about that breakpoint in Act 250 is the residential part, which the bill did a lot on, versus the commercial parts, which the bill didn't touch. And Act 250, it is more paperwork. It is more process. It's a bit more money. But you get a better product out of the end. How it really differs from zoning is Act 250 doesn't say office parks should go here and houses should go here and over here, is outdoor recreation. That zoning says where things go. Act 250 just says, oh, you want to go there? We're going to check wetlands. We're going to check traffic. We're going to check air quality. We're going to check all these things to make sure you're not kind of burdening other people with your impacts. And for projects that don't hit that, you're off. And so if you were to build in Royalton, for example, one of your towns, right? In the district, one of my towns, there's no local regulation besides floodplain regulation.
Okay.
So if so if you were going to build outside the flood zone and that type of thing, there's no permit. You need a state septic permit, and then you just build a house, right? As long as you're building 5 houses or less, no Act 250. That 6th house, now all of a sudden we're going to be looking at a whole pile of things, and whether or not that's the right number to be looking at, and certainly what the bill is in certain areas it took things off the table, but that's now all of a sudden I'm looking at endangered species, deer yards, historical resources, and that type of thing. I would say the historical resources is a big thing that local regulations don't cover. So if you're in a town that has zoning and you fall below Act 250, but you hit the zoning, there are a lot of things that are going to get hit, but they're not going to look at, typically the historical impact.
Yeah, and I think what we hear from developers is, I say there's this kind of mentality. It's like, we need housing so badly. It's like people we don't care about any of those other things. And that kind of felt like a fever pitch in the State House. And I think it's because we're experiencing so much of an unhoused crisis right now. So it has felt like the conversation around land use planning has it's how much can you control housing and the supply of housing through this. And I think a lot of the conversations we had with the housing crisis were kind of pointed at Act 250 or land use planning, when in reality, that's like almost the marginal reason why we're experiencing it. But that's so let's get into the bill, because we've like already talked for a while, so this is great. I was like, what will we talk about?
Oh, no.
So this legislative session, there were a lot of attempts to work on the housing crisis, and to also address, I would say, like the systemic racism that we've seen within how some of our regulations have disproportionately affected people of color and low-income Vermonters. So we worked really hard on that this year, and I think it was at the end of the day, a very positive exchange between the administration. So like Governor Phil Scott had a team of folks who worked on this bill. We also had folks from the environmental wing of the advocacy community. I mean, I think I heard an opinion from every possible angle of this conversation. But the bill that ended up being vetoed, but then overridden, so that means it did become law. That bill, 687, I don't know how many pages it ended up being. Like, what, 120? How many did we land?
Right there.
That's like, yeah.
That thick. It's thick as your finger.
It's not
171 pages.
It is a tome.
Double-spaced.
And it was kind of a back and forth exchange between, I'd say, all the different players who are affected by this conversation. So I don't know if you wanted to start, but like it started in economic development. I'm trying to remember. It didn't start in the House.
Right.
It started in economic development in the Senate. Then it came to natural resources, and then it went to the House.
Yep.
And then it came back to us, I think. But what was so could you describe a little bit of the process? You were in the room, so that's one of the cool things is we have a very open state house, and we had our commissioners be a part of those conversations and kind of expressing the desire. So I don't know if you could tell us from your perspective what the bill became.
I'd love to. And I bounced room to room as things moved throughout and at times I had to be in two rooms at once, so to speak. So this was a really interesting process, and I think was just, no matter what folks think of the final product, you have to acknowledge this was a historic conversation about how we manage our land, where we build our homes, what we want to do. And if nothing else, I think it was just really neat for all of us to be a part of it.
Completely.
We'll be talking about these last two sessions. Yeah. And I mean the last two sessions, because we had the Home Act.
Yeah.
2023.
S100.
That's right. And these two concepts are tied together. But we'll be talking about these for decades. So you can think of interestingly, the conversation started in the House in two different committees. Well, largely one committee. I'll simplify things here.
Don't worry, it's complex.
The administration worked with a group of legislators in the House to put forward a bill, H719, which was a large slate of some regulatory reform, some programmatic investments, some
Is this the tripartisan bill?
Exactly.
Okay, I remember this. So this was like, I'm telling you, this is the whole process of how a bill becomes a law. But that was Representative Taylor Small for the Progressives. Yep. I think Representative Catherine Sims and kind of the Rural Caucus being a part of that. And then I don't remember who the third
Representative Bartley of Fairfax.
Oh, great. Yes.
Ashley
Bartley. Yes. But I would say the Republicans, knowing that we have a Republican administration, it was almost, I think, all the Republicans in the House signed on. Almost all Republicans
signed on. Large swath of the Democrats signed on. I think perhaps a majority of the Democrats signed on. Okay. And then, obviously with Rep. Small, I believe
we do have a progressive party. Yeah.
So, it was fascinating. And the way that came together was really through conversations. The administration started it, and then we just chatted with Rep. Sims and the Rural Caucus and with Rep. Small. And what came together was something everyone was excited about. And it did inform the final bill. And so you had that bill that started in the House. That went to the same committee where another bill was starting, H687, which became the basis. Now, H687 started out broadly as a land use bill, with a primary focus on this conversation about Act 250 reform and jurisdiction of Act 250. And Act 250 doesn't really take geography into account in its jurisdiction in broad strokes. Right. And so how do we account for that? And what do we want to do about the long-term vision of governance of Act 250? So that bill was getting a lot of focus and attention. And it was a long process of tough discussions with a lot of partners coming in. While that's all going on, the tripartisan bill essentially got picked up, so to speak, on the Senate side. Senate,
oh, yeah, you're right. Uh-huh.
So this is how it happened. Senate Economic Development and Housing, led by Chair Rahm Hinsdale, basically picked that up and created. Who just
had her baby, by
That's
the
right.
way.
I saw that. That's exciting. Congratulations. Yeah. That's a good reminder.
Yes. The future.
And by the way, Senator Rahm Hinsdale, going into pre-labor, was setting me, can you follow up with this constituent? I think they have some really good questions about this. So always a public servant, never stopping. It's astonishing.
And so I'm really proud of the Senate. I mean, if I got one horse in this race, it's that I think the Senate really did very good work on this bill. And how it ended up. But so it went to economic development, and there was kind of two halves to the bill.
Exactly.
Where there was the exemptions and I would say more of the funding as well. And and then the other side was the policy and the land use. So it seemed like there were kind of two things squished together in that bill.
Yeah. I mean, the tripartisan bill that then the Senate picked up with Rahm Hinsdale's committee was exemptions that were intended to start immediately, which then made their way in here in the form of interim exemptions. It was incentives to try to incentivize redevelopment of housing using tax incentives. And it was programmatic investments into programs. Okay. And where it kind of blends between the two conversations is there was some appeals reform in there. What are the thresholds for an appeal? What should be standing for an appeal? And that's a complicated conversation that I think folks end up being really surprised. This does not cut cleanly.
I'm having flashbacks.
Yeah. But a lot of these things, they don't cut cleanly between party lines.
No,
I mean, these are really fascinating conversations.
Or even amongst, what's so interesting, I felt like there was a kind of rural and then urban is the wrong word. I love Vermont. But different larger communities. It felt like there was a bit of some tension there rather than party line, as you put it. So that was interesting.
Yeah. And these two things eventually came together because Senate Economic Development and Housing spent a lot of time working on their bill. House Environment and Energy spent a lot of time working on their bill. They both made their way over to your committee.
Yes, I know. So we were in the crosshairs. So
all eyes on you.
I know. So Senate Natural Resources, because of just the way it all sugared off, we went from doing, what bill did we start with? We started with a different bill and then we had fast. Oh, we did the Flood Safety Act.
Yeah.
We did this huge flood safety bill, and then we did this. And the level of intrigue, people had picked sides at this point and were gunning for different things. We ended up getting it. And I would say that you've got it was a very interesting dynamic. And then we ended up having, after it passed out of our committee, it ended up going, we had a strange process with that. It ended up being, I'm literally trying to remember, it ended up going to not conference committee.
Right. Exactly.
It ended up coming to the floor, and then we had multiple kind of committee conversations because it also pulled in, I think, finance at one point and Senate Natural Resources and Economic Development. And we were in rooms, Peter was in the room just we were trying to figure it out there at the end. And it was last man standing on some of these topics. But
it was a true omnibus bill. And so a lot of different players, a lot of different committees had jurisdiction. And as it passed through these various committees, and then eventually the entire body of the Senate passed it, wow, all that work, that was so great. And then, hey, by the way, it's got to go back to the House. We have to see if they agree. And then the House said, well, that's fine, but let's make this change to it. And the Senate said, that's okay, let's change it back this way. And the House, and then finally volleyed back and forth, and there was concurrence.
Yes.
And it was unbelievable to watch because I think the public that is listening to this, if they were to look at the changes, would say, boy, you're changing a few words here and a few words there, and you're really making big squabbles over this. Yes. And if you were to, Senator, we were talking earlier about where the governor landed on veto, and there was robust discussion. And the governor really, he had a lot of internal discussion because it's a massive omnibus bill. There's a lot of ways to look at it, and there's a lot of great stuff in there, and there's a lot of stuff in there that caused different folks consternation. Different folks on all kinds of sides of consternation.
Totally.
And the governor's message to legislators was, boy, there's a lot in here we like. Here are a few things that if you changed them, I'll sign this.
And kind of getting into the nitty gritty of what the bill did, because I think at the end of the day, it wasn't these really great philosophical differences that is what we were disagreeing on. We all kind of seem to agree with what we need and what Vermonters want their homes and businesses to be built. I mean, we kind of all have a similar vision, but it was nitty gritty things. Like I printed out, I said earlier, the email that we got pre the veto. Like, what would the governor have asked us to change? Yeah. And one of those that I immediately was like, oh gosh, I can't remember. This is the most intense conversation. Tiers. And 1A versus 1B. Yeah. And so what the bill did is it set up a new framework, or it will be, and this kind of gets into why people should be starting to pay attention to this conversation, is we're going to be developing what this bill set out to plan in the next 6 years. Yeah. And one of those is tiers. So the bill creates a framework for when something is in a tier 1A, which seems like our and you can, either of you, if you want to,
Chittenden County,
which will be largely Chittenden County, but tier 1A essentially means places we want development and we want lots of it, we want it quickly, and we want it big.
And they have sufficient zoning and review practices at the local level such that state review really is not needed, because we've checked all the boxes and made sure, oh yes, there's robust review.
Yeah. So they've got, like you said, we're talking about towns that are small, who may have no staff, to towns that have whole departments. So they don't really we don't want someone to have to jump through all the hoops on the town level and all the hoops on the state level if the town or city is really accomplishing that. So that we give that's our greenest light of development. Then tier 1B is kind of like our mid-range towns. Yeah. And there was a lot of debate I heard amongst people being like, well, would my town be tier 1B or would it be tier 2, which we'll talk about. But tier 1B is, I think, the fuzziest of the, what would you describe tier 1B as?
I think for the public out there, the overall gist of this is that Act 250 is staying unchanged on enormous amounts of land for housing.
Yes.
And so I brought a map here. So this is our region here. So this is, Hartford up to Newbury and over to the Green Mountain and stuff. And you see all the green on there. That's what people have to know. In there, none of this,
all Act 250 still.
Housing exemptions apply. It's really in these little dots, this being Hartford, this being Randolph, where a lot of the Act 250 would back up. And you'd just be left with the local zone. And so it's really in those specific areas where the carve-outs have been for the exemptions on housing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So that's really where, we don't need Act 250, if I'm going to build a bunch of houses in these little areas. Everywhere else, you're still going to have the Act 250 because we want to make the rules easier over here.
Yeah, we don't want a big apartment building in the middle of Chelsea. Or like not in the middle of Chelsea. Maybe in the middle, but not like in the back road, in the woods, where they don't have septic or like sewer.
And so that's where the 1B is going to come into play, is we kind of have these dots in the map as an interim guess.
Yeah, you don't actually know. We don't know.
No. And so the regional plans in the next 2 years are basically supposed to do the work that we do and then the work with towns to go, these are where your dots are right now, your villages, and where's the edge of your village?
Yeah.
And some people want to stretch those far in what I call the vacuum theory of development, that if we make a big empty spot, more people will go there than if we make a small spot. And you go, well, that's not actually how it works. If you have a bunch of empty lots in your current village, use those first. Yep. If we go, you have 5 empty lots, let's make it 20 empty lots. That doesn't bring more developers. Just doesn't work that way.
This is a Geiger point of interest right there. Just in case there's a planner watching.
The vacuum theory of development doesn't work. And it makes sense for communities to use their infrastructure. They've got sewer, water, and roads and stuff. It costs a lot to build a mile of line. Exactly. You've already got a line. Use that as much as you can.
So those towns, like I think of a tier 1B town as potentially Royalton.
Yep.
But
they don't have any zoning, so they can't be.
Just kidding. So it's those kinds
unless they adopt.
Unless they adopt. So it does also give a little bit of an incentive to get, if you're a community that says, hey, we really know we want development. We know we want more housing. We need it. We've got the infrastructure, but we don't quite have this, maybe bureaucratic isn't the right word, but like regulatory framework within our town. So we need to invest in that to get us to a place where we open ourselves up to an easier development process. Like it's a little bit of like a cycle. So then tier 2 is just about everybody else.
Most of the rural lands, what we'd think of as rural lands, not the deep forest, but out there. And then tier 3.
Ooh, this is the one that we in natural resources spent the most amount of time on.
And that's a little bit later in the process, but that's really where any development practically in tier 3 lands, which are, think of the deep woods as an easy way to think of that, will now trigger Act 250. So it's not 5 houses, it's a house.
A house.
And it's not a commercial project over an acre, it's a commercial project, period. But those areas right now are largely roadless.
Yeah.
In fact, they're usually quite a ways from roads. They are our deer yards. They're where we get the clean water we drink from, because the clean water is obviously not coming from the water that goes into the ground in downtown Hartford, right? You know,
you're telling me it's coming off of Mount Scottney or something?
It's coming out of the woods out there where nobody is, which is why we want those out there.
Those high quality Class A waters. A whole nother topic if you want to.
And that's where the fish are happy. Those waters out there, the bears are happy. And so it tightens up the regulation out there.
Yes. And that was an excitement.
Over here.
That was a big excitement, I think, for me in particular, because as we're watching this process, I felt like economic development in those conversations were like tier 1, a little bit of tier 2 was where we got like in the woods. And then tier 3 was the purview of natural resources. And it's those places that I think Vermonters can even just think up off the top of their heads. Everyone has a place like that in their town, if not tons of them. And so we had a lot of back and forth of, well, what does tier 3 mean? What is the like the bubble of tier 3? And I really landed on, I would like a bigger bubble for tier 3 than a smaller bubble, because the people who seem to be able to build next to the beautiful waterfall in the wood seems to be people who are very wealthy.
Right.
And that's kind of where I think some of the debates around the road rule came into effect. So I just want to, we'll put in the road rule and then we got to start wrapping up.
Okay.
So, because we had but could we talk a little bit about the road rule and what that is? Because it comes up quite a bit in these conversations. And it was like a little bit of a tennis ball.
And it's back.
And it's back.
Because we used to have the road rule.
Yeah.
And in fact, Senator McCormick would remember when we passed Act 250, which was, I was alive, but I wasn't working on it for sure. There was a state land use map. So we had, in essence, statewide zoning. We had a future land use map for the entire state as part of that. Then they repealed that part of Act 250, and then they left the regulatory side. So they kind of repealed the planning side.
So we're righting the ship finally all these decades
and so a little
later.
bit of this is coming back, in there. But the 800-foot rule is in there. And so if
this is a drive,
Yes. So if you're building, basically a big, long drive.
Yeah.
And so you think of that in a lot of our towns. You go, oh, somebody's going to buy a big chunk of land and they're going to build a great big driveway and put a house on top of the mountain. Then you can all look at the house.
I get that that's like the ideal dream of like someone, but the people who can do that, it's like not at the expense of our forest blocks and our beautiful spaces. So
because even a road is as much as we humans might go, it's just a road. Even a single road cut through the forest drastically changes that forest. And the way I think of that is if I just, took a magic marker and made a line through the Mona Lisa, and I said, well, it's still the Mona Lisa, it's just got this little line through it. People be like, that's not the same. And you go, that's what...
See, this is the conversations we're having down here. Driveways are big deals, but I know the administration kind of disagreed on that point. They did not want the road rule to come back in.
Yeah, I think there was a few reasons for that. One of which is just pure history, which is that Governor Phil Scott, who at the time, 20-something years ago, was Senator Phil Scott in the state Senate.
Was sitting in natural resources.
Yeah. He, along with then Senator Welch and a few others, I think Senator Lyons, who luckily is still Senator Lyons, fortunately for all of us. There was a large contingent of folks who saw this as an additional way to trigger Act 250 jurisdiction that they didn't think made sense. Whether or not, people have reasons why it should, people have reasons why it shouldn't. Kevin highlighted a good one. But where I can say, and, I think where there is logical room to say this fits into our broader framework is that we're advocating for density, or at least...
That's just my
call. What? This is get a call.
No, that's just my phone telling
Senator Welch is calling to weigh in on whether he agrees. Have we misrepresented his position?
No.
And Senator McCormick was there too.
Yes, that's right. Senator McCormick, of course, is
he
there.
always comments. He was like, I was Phil Scott's first committee chair. And I love it. It's such a good...
Yeah. Well, and the nice thing is, quick side note, I think the governor feels a nice kinship to a lot of the folks, especially still in the Senate, because several of them are there that were his colleagues, and he just knows how it feels. Yeah.
And Senator, we should point out, we can't not talk about the road rule and forget that Senator Dick Sears, who passed away, who was just a legend, like a lion of the Senate, he was actually the person who brought the amendment to take out the road rule. So out of the bill. So really there's no, I would say, correct answer on this. There's just different value sets and not like good or bad, just different.
But broadly speaking, why are we trying to allow for more density in certain areas? And Senator, you made a point earlier I should have touched on, which is just that historically, not just in Vermont, but in a lot of places, zoning and permitting and land use has disenfranchised and at least disadvantaged a lot of folks who are either on the lower end of the economic spectrum, or we are imposing sort of, you could say, Euro or Anglican ideals of what housing should be on folks.
The book.
And a book that everyone should read, The Color of Law, as well as Just Action.
This is the sequel. This is but that really, it really colored our discussion, The Color of Law book, because segregation and redlining, Vermont when you think about the fact that we are the second most white state in the country, that's not an accident. That's not just because of some cultural difference. It's because of policies that we've put in place. So that I really appreciate that. And I know that we had the executive director, Susanna Davis, who came, and we also had some folks from her environmental equity I don't know if it's a department, but we had many conversations about that, because it just underlines so many of the ways that Vermont has discriminated against people, and housing and access to housing is a foundational one that we've just...
And in subtle ways. I mean, these aren't laws that say we don't like this type of thing here, or we don't... Yeah. It's very subtle, such as... If you have single family zoning, that creates a certain type of housing and economic condition that oftentimes only certain folks can afford to live in. Yeah. And so you just create conditions, perhaps by, just perpetuation of what we know and what we like. Yeah. We create certain conditions that exclude people.
Yep. Exactly.
And so we should hit, because so much development does not trigger Act 250.
Oh, true.
And I think, to me, one of the most powerful things in this bill that addresses inequity is really things that enable more rentals.
Oh, yeah.
Because rentals are really seen as, those are for poor people.
Yeah.
And poor people, this, whatever attribute people want to assign to that. And you go, like, stop it. And so what this bill and the previous bill really did to me is they made multifamily housing pretty much out there. They made duplexes ubiquitous.
Duplex by right. I think even triplex by right is.
So we have triplex and quads now out there. And so all of which won't trigger Act 250. And so to me, the people out there who have a house, and that house is much bigger for you than you need, turning it into a triplex or a duplex, you don't have to rent it. turning it into a duplex, you just sell the other half. You're done.
And Kevin, what program should they use that could help fund that? I wonder if there's a really good state program.
There are a couple for rentals. I'm not so sure on the sales. Side.
Oh, okay.
Because
what program?
But VHIP, or I don't know what it's
the
called. The
Vermont Housing Improvement Program. Quick plug. All right, continue.
Yes. No, for rentals, definitely out there. We're working on a project because we think a lot of folks live in houses that are bigger than them, but they're 70, they don't want a mortgage. They're not that interested in rental income to pay off the mortgage because they're
they've either
70.
paid it off or it's like, why deal with it? Yeah.
But can I duplex this thing? And that's where we think there's thousands and thousands and thousands
I completely agree.
to be made in those houses. Mm-hmm. And yes, we need lots of stuff in downtowns. And a lot of those houses are in our current downtowns. Mm-hmm. But they're also, if you're out in a community that doesn't have sewer and water, we can't put that many units in your downtown because they just won't work right now. But there are a lot of homes out there that can be duplexed or triplexed, and you will not know it driving by. And we will double and triple the number of our homes.
So I did want to just talk about one of the, I think, underlying conversations. You hit a little bit on it, but different towns have different support. There's different levels of support for affordable housing, depending on the community. And what I have experienced growing up in Hartford, I grew up low income. I live actually in a Twin Pines Housing Trust homeownership home, which means that they helped give a down payment, and there's like a trust, exactly, which is basically the reason why I can even be in the Senate, is because I have such low cost to my housing. And then my mother also lives with us, so we don't have an ADU. We'd love one, but she lives in the house. And she's on the waiting list for affordable housing, and we want her to be in the Riverwalk. I mean, if Andrew Winter's listening, go to the Riverwalk, give Mona away. No, it doesn't work like that. But affordable housing is happening in Hartford, for example. Yeah. But I hear folks say, I don't see affordable housing in other communities. So how do we address that? And if you live in a community that doesn't traditionally have affordable housing, what would you do in the next couple of years as we continue to roll this stuff out?
I'll give a couple, then I'm sure you got some ideas.
Sure.
I would say get sewer or water if you can. And there are places out there that have it, and places out there that could get it. Probably water first if you've got the soils for sewer.
Yeah, because we put a thing for tier. It's like if you had the capacity to do it.
Yeah, that's right. Suitable soils.
Yes.
Because you can put a water system out there and then everybody can, as long as the soils are okay, have their own system. So that level of infrastructure in your, community centers is number one, I would say. The other thing is to use whatever local system you have to try to identify those houses you have. Yeah. We did a little project in Rochester because, there were some voices in Rochester saying there's nowhere to build. It's the villages. We found 60 lots under the current zoning before all this legislation passed. We're like, we could put more houses than you'd possibly imagine in here under your current zoning.
Wow.
But people just don't see that. And I always,
it's hard. Yeah.
I tell any community out there, I can come to your town and stand in the middle of the town and throw a tennis ball and land it on someplace where I'm sure we can build more houses. Because people are like, and you go, right there.
So you would say maybe have a conversation with your regional planning commission.
Right. to envision the spaces, because in some of our towns, it's literally going to be 3 people going, I've got a barn out back, or my house is too big. But then how do we help that person do it? Mm-hmm. Because they don't want to be a developer. As you were talking earlier, the developers, they've got that muscle, right?
Yeah.
All those helpers where you go, I got a 70-year-old lady living in a great big old farmhouse. She doesn't want to do everything. Yeah. And so that's where I think, and one of the projects we're working on is how do we bring that kit of expertise to those landowners? Mm-hmm. And some state money would be great for
the bill funds
for the rentals and stuff. But how do we also go, well, we can help you with permitting, or we can help you with design, or we can help you with the legal aspect of it, kind of minimize your house. and do some of those things that will just make it easier. But I think also the big social aspect of it is how do we get people to be like, oh, it's okay to have, some more families close.
Sure. And
because I think we all get nervous, as much as we are big of heart. We all get like, oh, who's going to be next door? And then there are great people next door. And you're like, why was I being such a, sin about that?
I think that there is a lot of stigma that comes with affordable housing. And also, as you pointed out earlier, the idea of renters. And I think for Vermonters, we have this vision of what housing should look like, and it doesn't always mean affordable. So I hope that we can I think part of our job as politicians is to help break down some of that stigma, because it's really holding us all back from having people in our communities who work in our small businesses. Like, the reason the housing shortage matters isn't just because, if you don't care about folks being unhoused, we're probably not going to relate on a lot of things. But let's say you don't care about that issue. You probably want someone who has workforce housing available to them, so they're not driving 2 hours or an hour to get to the downtown. But I don't know if you could speak a little bit to just kind of how, so we put some exemptions in the bill. So if you were a developer, there's some things you could be doing now. Right. But if you're a layperson, what would you be doing to get involved with getting more affordable housing and housing in your community?
I'd say a few things. I think the pandemic allowed us the opportunity to try things out that, with limited resources in past budgets for decades and decades, we haven't been able to get certain things off the ground. And one of those things that really opened up the opportunity for state funding to fund affordable housing, and not just through the typical nonprofits, was VHIP, the Vermont Housing Improvement Program. And I can't help but plug it. But really, what's so great about VHIP, well, there's a few things I think are great about VHIP, but one of the things that I particularly love about it is that a property owner, if you own just your home and no other property, you can access VHIP. Right.
Okay.
You can get up to $50,000 to add an accessory dwelling unit, to split up your home into multiple units, and then you rent those. And you have a couple options. If you're putting in an ADU, it's fairly flexible as long as you keep your rents at an affordable level, under 80% of the area median income. That just means basically a working person or lower income person could afford it.
And I'll tell you, we actually looked into the ADU thing and that program, and I have to talk to Andrew Winter at some point, but because of our trust, we didn't. I was like, dang it. So you're telling me I can't get the ADU money? I'm the person. We might need to change that law.
We should talk about this. So this is the mechanism through which we make sure that things stay affordable, or they serve the population we want to serve, which is through a covenant on the title.
Yeah.
And so when you accept this, you still own your home. It's your home, free and clear, with the note that while in exchange for this $50,000 you get, during 5 years or 10 years, depending on which you opt for, during those 5 years, you will serve folks that are, meet the income threshold.
Yeah.
Right. Which are, people's perception of those people.
Oh, is
those people are teachers and police officers.
My
and
mom.
like
those people are retired folks on fixed incomes. Those folks are exactly teachers. It's people with kids. It's not this group of folks who aren't working, which I think sometimes that there is. Yeah.
If you think about it, that could be. So 80% of the area median income is often the threshold that, and when you talk about that, for a single person household, that could be someone making $45,000, $50,000.
Yeah.
That's just a middle income household. And so we also have covenants through which, let's say you're not putting in an ADU and you want to opt for something more. You've got a couple options. You want to put in rental units and you're not one of these big developers. Firstly, we've got to pair with VHIP, we have the Homes for All Design and Do Toolkit. So this is to help folks who aren't developers, but you want to learn how maybe I want to put in a unit or I want to change up my property. This will walk you from the very start of the process. What do you need to take into account? What can I do on my property, zoning and all that? How do I build a pro forma to figure out the finances of it?
Ooh.
What are some possible plans? What could this look like? All of it. And so please go to our ACCD.vermont.com.
This is www.vermont.
Homes for All, though. Check that out. And it pairs with VHIP. And so then, with VHIP, you can either opt for a 5-year covenant on your home, and you've got to, during that 5 years, rehouse somebody who is recently exiting homelessness.
Okay.
Or a longer term, 10 years, and you're just, similar to the ADU, housing somebody that's 80% or lower of the area median income.
So if you, let's say you lived in downtown White River Junction, you really care about affordable housing and you'd like to add an ADU, there's programs where you don't need to just shell out the start money. You can really get support to do it. And there's tons of really interesting styles of accessory dwelling units now. Like you can get almost like prefab ones, but it doesn't need to be that. It could be the mother-in-law suite above the garage. Absolutely. It could be a basement that's refitted. I mean, there's lots of different. That's exciting.
Well, and we're all plugged that I think the three of us can work together now. Is Homes for All, this design to do toolkit. I think the next phase that you'll hear my team talking a lot about is let's put together designs which communities could adopt as pre-approved designs. So say
it's been done around the country. Is just pull them off the shelf and go, I'll take option A. And I think that would also help.
That would be so helpful because people don't know what they're looking for.
Then the community says, here's your permit. You chose option A. Here you go.
Right.
Guys.
Of course, we could go further. We could just say they're permitted at the state level.
That's right. We could.
And we're done. Done with that discussion. Right. That's good for freestanding units because you can see it looks like this. And both the Homes for All kit in there has a lot of pictures of current affordable housing just to break the stereotype.
What is it like?
If you were to go around Wentworth here and Hartford and stuff, you can see some really nice affordable housing out there. And the picture we draw in our minds is not the accurate picture.
Yeah, I think people think of communist cubist, brick affordable housing, and it doesn't look like that. You'd be surprised. We've in Wilder, where my family's home is on Hartford Ave, we're next to this place called Data Man. It's our house. Yep. And then there was this empty lot for years.
Yeah, we worked on that.
Yeah,
Tip-top.
it was it was it's so beautiful. It's got this gorgeous metal sculpture on the outside. And if it's affordable housing, if it's not affordable housing, you wouldn't know. Right. And it really integrates with the community because I think what I hear from communities who have some pushback to affordable housing, some of it is aesthetics. Yeah. They think, I don't want to have something that doesn't look like beautiful Woodstock, beautiful Norwich, historical locations. And actually, that's not the issue anymore. We can really make these fit and integrate into the community. You can get me on that forever.
If you were to drive around Woodstock's a good example. There's about 50 affordable units in Woodstock. We just don't think of them that way because the inn owns them for their worker housing.
Right? Oh, good point.
But they're affordable housing. That's why the inn owns them. So the workers have them. And they're just, houses strewn around town. You don't think anything of it one way or another.
So we'll start to wrap up, but I had just one final thought I wanted to leave both of you with, if you could comment on it, which is the bill that we've been talking about, 687 Act 121. 181 is what it landed on. See, once it gets passed, I go, that's the administration and the implementer's job. What would you do, or what would you tell folks that they need to know for the next few years? What should they do to be a part of the conversations around the tiers or their local zoning or any of the, what should they be doing?
The big thing that's going to be on our plate and on all regional planning commissions' plate, Devin from Rutland Regional Commission was on the radio this morning, is in the next 2 years, we are required to work on our future land use map for the region, which then we're going to have discussions with towns about their future land use map, which will be more detailed, as you can imagine. But that's really going to be not so much where's your village, because, we know the villages aren't in the middle of somewhere, but where's the edge of your village?
Yes.
Where do you want that thing to be? And do you want it to go a little more there, or is this really the edge here? And then if we have really small villages, maybe some things around those areas.
Sure. So if you're in the center of a Scutney or Brownsville or Proctorsville or I don't know, if you're in a little, if you've got a designation for your village center and you're in Hartford Village, all of those places, it's time to tune in a little bit when you see that meeting at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday night, maybe at the library.
Because again, that's where the democracy is going to happen. Not once we get all said and done with this and we do the regional plan, they do the town plan, they do the zoning, and then somebody comes in with a permit, and you go, well, I don't like that.
Yeah.
No,
you gotta get back.
I don't like it. Is back in all those boring committee rows, right?
Well, we really appreciated all the work that Two Rivers did during the legislative session to kind of get us information, because as legislators, we might have individual opinions, but then you as an organization and the regional planning commissions and planners association, you all have the job of doing this. So we wanted to make sure that you had the funding and the ability to implement and plan. So thank you for that. And shout out to Peter Gregory, your executive director. Whoop, whoop. But yeah, Alex, what would you, if folks wanted to learn more about the process? I know the administration is coming out with guidance at some point on a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So what's happening?
Well, we've started to, in the short term, helping people understand what these interim exemptions are.
Yeah.
And Kevin was talking about this earlier. While this mapping goes on, and while the longer term tiers are put in place and all the new governance structure with the LURB, we have exemptions in place that started in July. And so for 2 years until 2027, we have these great exemptions that I think folks will really need to examine to see what opportunities are there.
So an exemption might be, for example, a homeless shelter or a place where unhoused folks, if it's it basically doesn't have the same zoning or the same requirements that it did previously. It's a first response location. There's like a bunch of different
There's that type of thing, but there's also just 50 units.
50 units, yeah.
And any 50 units within downtowns plus a half a mile. Right. 75 units in, that's in new town centers, growth centers, neighborhood development areas. There's some... For some of those, there's some affordability requirements. But
so this is a big ramp up for 2 years. If you were a developer who's got a project in the pipeline, you're ready to go.
In designated downtowns, which doesn't cross over by where Town Hall is in Hartford. Okay. But really think of this area here. Unlimited number of housing, exempt from activity.
So if you were a developer and you wanted to build, you would come to White River Junction
or Randolph. In my region,
we've got 25 designated downtowns throughout the state. So and they're specific confined spaces, but in those spaces we want to maximize it. We don't want vacant lots there. We don't want vacant buildings. Try to find something, and so. You can go to the Natural Resources Board website and you can look at these boundaries. We have an interactive tool, and so folks
it'll make this map.
Yeah,
like here's Hartford. It'll make you a little map. You can see
the zoom in,
and so it'll kind of give you this blobs, and things get easier.
This is exciting. I'm excited to have people move into our community and have places they can live, or have my friends be able to move back home. That's really, if you want to know why I supported this bill, it's because I want my friends to be able to move back home.
Right. And Seth Leonard, who you both know, I think, Seth Leonard has one of the great lines. He says, homes are where jobs go to sleep. And,
So if you're a big employer, it matters.
If you're a big employer, if you like to not, to go to the general store and them not to be closed on, Tuesday. And you're like, what?
You want to get a haircut. Literally, our lives depend on it.
You want a road crew.
You want a road crew.
Well, but Senator White and I went to UVM at the same time. For our classmates, come back up 89 and come here. There's going to be some opportunities.
Commissioner Farrell and I will be out saying, welcome back to Vermont.
That's right. With Catamount hats on.
It'll be great. Well, thank you both. And thank you, Commissioner. It's so wonderful to be able to have a kind of a debrief, even for me, on what we did during the session, because once the legislative session ends, as I said, we hand it off. In the administration, it's really your job now to help fulfill some of the promises and vision we put into this. And I know that you've got a really good team of folks. And even though we often disagree, it's very nice to work with your team. So we hope, hopefully more.
We will do more. Yes.
Cool. Well, thanks both. That's it. Thank you.
Okay.